Imagine spending $90 million engineering a highly anticipated consumer product. You hire the absolute best talent in the world. You execute the production schedule perfectly. You wrap the final build. And the product is sitting on a secure server, fully functional and ready to ship to millions of eager users. But instead of clicking launch, the chief executive logs into the mainframe, highlights the entire directory, and hits delete, permanently wiping it from existence. That is exactly what happened with the movie Batgirl to normal people, and certainly to the millions of fans watching from the outside. Destroying a completed $90 million piece of art looks like pure corporate insanity. You are probably thinking, why would anyone burn a finished product instead of just releasing it and making at least some of their money back to cover the overhead? But here is the brutal, hidden truth of corporate finance that they absolutely do not teach you in film school or liberal arts programs. When a company is drowning in $34.5 billion of toxic floating rate debt, the actual product no longer matters. Art becomes inventory. And when the financial spreadsheet dictates that a massive tax write-off will generate more immediate liquidity than the projected box office revenue, the accounting department will execute that asset without a second thought. This was not a creative choice. It was a margin call. We are watching the real-time dismantling of Warner Brothers, a 100-year-old titan that survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the rise of television, only to be gutted, stripped for parts, and auctioned off to the tech algorithms in an $82 billion fire sale. Today, we are going to look strictly at the numbers, the cash flows, and the sheer magnitude of the leverage that forced David Zaslav into a corner. We are going to tear down the exact mechanics of the AT&T spin-off, the Discovery merger, and the fatal decision to strip the prestigious HBO name off their flagship streaming app. Let us be real. You do not kill a golden goose unless you are starving to death. And Warner Brothers was financially starving on a level that is almost impossible to comprehend. So how did the absolute gold standard of Hollywood become a distressed asset, begging for a bailout from Silicon Valley? We have to look at the source code of this disaster, because the fatal bugs were written into the system long before David Zaslav ever stepped onto the Burbank lot. For a century, Warner Brothers operated on a very specific high-margin business model. They took concentrated risks on creative visionaries, built massive economic moats around intellectual property, like Batman and Harry Potter, and monetized those assets across theaters, cable syndication, and physical media. It was a beautiful cash-generating machine that printed money through a highly defensible distribution funnel. But the structural rot started when telecom conglomerates looked at Hollywood and arrogantly assumed they could run an art studio like a municipal utility grid. The fatal turning point was the AT&T acquisition in 2018. AT&T bought Time Warner for $85 billion, fundamentally believing they could bundle premium content with mobile phone plans to artificially lower their cellular customer churn rate. Think about that underlying logic for a second. They bought the studio that made Casablanca and The Sopranos, simply to convince you not to switch your cell phone provider to Verizon. But doing this required taking on an unbelievable amount of debt on the parent company balance sheet. I have seen this exact dynamic play out so many times when I look at the illusion of high paper valuations versus actual free cash flow. A massive conglomerate will point to an $85 billion enterprise value and brag to the financial press about synergistic ecosystems. But when you strip away the accounting goodwill and look at the actual unit economics, you realize the core engine is actively bleeding cash. You can pump up a stock price with a fancy acquisition announcement, but you cannot fake the free cash flow required to service billions of dollars in quarterly interest payments. When the macroeconomic environment shifted and the Federal Reserve started hiking interest rates, AT&T realized they were holding a ticking time bomb. They needed to offload the debt, and they needed to do it immediately. So they engineered a massive corporate spin-off, merging Warner Media with Discovery in 2022. I can picture the exact environment where a complex restructuring deal like that is finalized. Big law attorneys reviewing a 100-page mergers and acquisitions, Contract at 2 a.m. in a Century City high-rise. Aggressively redlining financial covenants, while the investment bankers try to figure out how to package $34.5 billion of gross liabilities into a new entity that the public equity markets will actually swallow. UT walked away with billions in cash to clean up their own telecom balance sheet. And they dumped the entire mountain of debt directly onto the newly formed Warner Bros. Discovery. They handed the keys to David Zaslav, a guy who built his career turning the Discovery Channel from high-end educational programming into a highly profitable reality television factory, pumping out cheap unscripted shows like 90 Day Fiancé and Dr. Pimple Popper. The mandate from Wall Street was incredibly clear. Stop the bleeding. Execute $3 billion in cost synergies. And somehow build a streaming infrastructure to compete with Netflix. Before we get into the crazy part, drop a like. It really supports the channel and helps us expose more of these business realities. So let us break down the exact operational nightmare Zaslav inherited. You have a legacy cable television business that is in terminal decline, shedding paying subscribers every single month as people cut the cord. That linear cable business was the primary cash cow, funding the massively expensive prestige dramas on HBO. Without those guaranteed, high-margin cable carriage fees, the company was forced to pivot entirely to direct-to-consumer streaming. But the direct-to-consumer model is completely broken for legacy media companies that do not own the underlying tech stack. When you are operating in the streaming wars, you are in a vicious cycle of burning millions on customer acquisition cost versus the brutal reality of customer lifetime value. You spend $50 in digital marketing and meta ads to acquire a new subscriber for your platform, hoping they stay for 10 months just to break even. But the second, the season finale of a massive show like House of the Dragon airs, that user immediately cancels their subscription. Your churn rate spikes, your lifetime value metric plummets, and your customer acquisition cost takes years to recover. If it ever does, you are essentially renting your audience instead of owning them. And all the while, that $34.5 billion of debt is sitting on the balance sheet, demanding hundreds of millions of dollars in mandatory interest payments every single quarter. Regardless of how many people watch your new show, this is where the entire system completely buckles under its own weight. By 2023 and into 2024, the executives at Warner Bros. Discovery were staring down the barrel of massive debt maturities. When you owe billions and your free cash flow is severely restricted, you have to find liquidity anywhere you can legally find it. That is the only logical way to explain the deployment of the accounting mechanism known as content impairment. Zaslav looked at the release schedule and saw fully produced movies like Batgirl and Coyote vs. Acme. These were mid-tier budget films that were greenlit during the era of zero interest rate policy, when the strategy was just to flood the streaming servers with exclusive content to pump up subscriber numbers. But in a high interest rate environment where cash is king, releasing those movies would require spending another $30 to $40 million on global marketing and distribution. If the movie bombs, you lose the initial production budget plus the massive marketing spend. However, if you cancel the movie entirely and lock the hard drives in a vault, the United States tax code allows you to declare it a total loss and write it off against your profitable assets, immediately lowering your corporate tax burden and preserving vital cash. It is a sterile mathematical decision, but the collateral damage of that decision destroyed the core operating system of the studio. Hollywood is not a software as a service company. You cannot just swap out a vendor when you want to lower your server costs. The entertainment industry runs entirely on human capital, leverage, and trust. The moment elite directors and A-list actors realized that Warner Bros. Would delete their life's work for a fractional tax benefit, the talent pipeline instantly froze. I have seen the exact same panic during mergers and acquisitions, due diligence horror stories, where a private equity buyer comes in, looks at the capitalization table, and immediately starts terminating key infrastructure engineers just to optimize the quarterly EBITDA before the ink on the contract is even dry. It destroys the company culture overnight, and all your top talent immediately walks out the door. Heavyweights, Like Christopher Nolan publicly severed ties with the studio, calling out the bait-and-switch tactics. The culture inside Warner Brothers became actively hostile to its own history. Then came the rebranding strategy, which might mathematically be one of the most self-destructive corporate moves of the modern era. They took HBO, a brand that spent 40 years establishing itself as the undisputed pinnacle of premium television, and they stripped its name off the app. They rebranded the entire platform as Max. The executive thesis was to merge the prestige HBO library with Discovery's massive catalogue of reality television sludge to create a mega app that appealed to every demographic. They thought offering more total hours of content would artificially lower the churn rate. Instead, it aggressively diluted the most valuable intellectual property they owned. Imagine staring at the Stripe dashboard as monthly recurring revenue plummets in real time because you completely confused your core demographic. Users who were happily paying $15 a month for Succession and The Sopranos suddenly found their home screens cluttered with Naked and Afraid. It signaled a massive, unavoidable downgrade in product quality. The churn did not improve. The brand equity was completely fractured, and the user interface became a chaotic mess of conflicting genres. This is the ultimate contrast between Silicon Valley hype and actual unit economics. You can tell your shareholders and the financial press that you are building the ultimate aggregation platform, but if the end user feels like they are digging through a digital dumpster just to find a good movie, they will simply log into their account and cancel their credit card autopay. By the start of 2025, the stock was trading at absolute historic lows, dropping down to around $7.52, a share from a post-merger high of $30. The market capitalization was shrinking rapidly, but the debt was not. The math simply no longer worked. The board of directors finally realized that the combination of declining linear television revenues and an unprofitable streaming service was dragging the highly valuable film assets down with the sinking ship. So they initiated a desperate surgical corporate maneuver. In June of 2025, they announced a plan to split the company. They wanted to separate the highly valuable film studio, the DC Universe, and the streaming platform from the toxic, dying cable networks. The structural idea was to quarantine the bad assets so the good assets could command a premium valuation on the open market. But it was far too late. The sharks were already circling. The blood was in the water, and the distressed asset buyers knew that Warner Brothers was completely cornered. We started seeing the Bloomberg terminal flashing red during a massive, coordinated sell-off, as institutional investors dumped the stock upon hearing whispers of a strategic review. That is Wall Street code for a complete fire sale. Two massive entities stepped into the arena to bid on the remains. Paramount, heavily backed by tech money after its Skydance merger, and Netflix. Paramount tried to play the legacy card, offering a highly leveraged package valued around $108.4 billion. They argued that a merger of two traditional studios would protect the Hollywood ecosystem from the tech industry, but Netflix moved with the terrifying ruthlessness of a pure software monopoly. They did not carry the massive baggage of legacy cable debt. They had unbelievable free cash flow, and they offered an $82.7 billion all-cash majority bid that completely bypassed the emotional pleas of the traditional film industry. Netflix understood exactly what they were buying, and it was not a movie studio. They were buying raw user retention data. They were buying the intellectual property rights to Batman and Harry Potter to feed directly into their algorithmic recommendation engine. They were buying the training data of 100 years of cinema to train their proprietary artificial intelligence models. When we look at the absolute wreckage of this $82 billion collapse, the post-mortem autopsy reveals a profound, irreversible shift in how business operates in the modern economy. The independent Warner Brothers is gone, swallowed by a tech giant that views art purely as engagement metrics and retention graphs. This is exactly what happens when aggressive financial engineering completely overrides product quality. You start with cheap capital, you inflate the valuation with reckless, debt-fueled mergers, and when the music inevitably stops, the leverage crushes the entire foundation. I know exactly what that feels like. The quiet, devastating realization staring at an Excel cash flow projection at 3 a.m., knowing that no matter how much top-line revenue you bring in, the compounding interest payments will consume every single dollar of operating profit. You absolutely cannot outgrow a structurally flawed balance sheet. This entire saga perfectly illustrates the massive difference between bootstrapping a profitable business versus taking toxic institutional money. When you bootstrap, your only master is the customer. You have to meticulously engineer a product they actually want to buy and use. But when you take on tens of billions of dollars from telecom conglomerates and Wall Street investment banks, your master becomes the debt covenant. You stop optimizing for user experience and you start optimizing for immediate liquidity. Even if it means actively destroying your own brand to secure a tax write-off. David Zaslav was not an evil mastermind. He was just the executioner carrying out the strict mandate of the distressed debt markets. He proved mathematically that if you treat premium assets like commodity trash for long enough, the only buyer left will be a recycling plant. Warner Brothers traded their century of creative legacy for a stock ticker symbol and a quick exit. They can feed Humphrey Bogart into a generative AI machine and synthesize a new franchise sequel without ever hiring a single physical actor. The directors, the writers, and the legacy of the Hollywood studio system were systematically dismantled by corporate greed, an over-reliance on cheap debt, and a fundamental misunderstanding of streaming unit economics. The Dream Factory was heavily leveraged, margin called, and fully liquidated. And now, the absolute icons of our shared culture belong to a server farm in Los Gatos. And we are all just subscribers paying a monthly fee to access the archives.